Hello, everyone. This is a conversation about fascism and political extremism I recorded with Zombie, a friend and Twitter mutual who had enough thoughts about a thread I did on Mussolini that we decided to do a podcast. Zombie produces several types of content, and if you find this interesting, I strongly recommend checking out his other work. He maintains an awesome Twitter presence, and most of it can be found there, but I will drop some links in the description. And here is the podcast.
Here's my thing, and you can leave this in. We can start right with this, or you can cut this out. Do we want to begin by saying that we are not Nazis? Because, that's the safe thing to do, but also it's frustrating because I feel like that should be implied.
I'm very comfortable saying I'm not a Nazi.
Okay. All right. Well, just for the record, yeah, okay. I'm here to talk about fascism. I have a bunch of thoughts, but that doesn't mean that I'm a Nazi.
Well, now I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable because I feel like I will be playing devil's advocate a little bit in some places where this is my angle on this kind of. I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis, and one thing Lewis said, Lewis was Catholic. If you didn't know that, you probably did. Lewis always said that these political heresies, these movements, it's basically always true that they play into some very real weakness in our systems, something we're ignoring and not taking care of. And the fact that we're failing to be diligent with these aspects of our own systems leaves them on the table and lets bad actors come around and swipe them up. So in a way, I think the healthy approach to politics is understand what are we not doing that is leaving us vulnerable to bad actors. And that demands a certain amount of sympathy, if not empathy, or vice versa.
Wow. I was trying to say that by just being mad that people might call me a Nazi, but yeah, I agree with that perspective. It's like, you don't get anywhere with all bad ideas, right? Like with any sort of system politically that eventually becomes corrupted. It's not like a bunch of people showed up and every idea they had was bad and somehow it still worked. It's just that the totality of the thing as a proposed alternative to, whatever we're doing, I'm in Canada, so we do parliamentary democracy or whatever. It's the proposed alternative to that was worse, but it's not like Mussolini was the world's dumbest guy and he had a bunch of awful ideas and was like, yo, I don't know what to say, but there's just this idea that we have to think of these people as incredibly powerful, but also sort of not smart enough to read or something. And that's just the way that people can psyop themselves in that perspective really sort of disturbs me.
I won't get too into it. One of my all-time favorite quotes, I think it was John Quincy Adams' grandson. I think it was Henry Adams who said this. It came up on another podcast. It was after the Civil War. He was very upset that after the Civil War, we did not hang Lee. And he specifically clarified, I do not care that Lee was a good man, because good men always do the greatest harms in the world.
Whoa. That's pretty intense, actually.
We brought this up in the context of Bone Druid from Made in Abyss. My explanation there was a bad person, a completely corrupt person, only destroys things for greed, but someone who is kind of good in parts will take a dysfunctional system and prop it up until it turns into something completely terrifying. And I would cast Mussolini in that light, where there was some virtue there, but it was in a context where it led to something really ugly.
Well, that's do you know Jim Jones of Jonestown and, Don't Drink the Kool-Aid?
Yes, I don't know him deeply. I do know about that.
Yeah, so when he was in America, starting out as a pastor, his whole thing was racial equality. And it doesn't make sense for people not to worship together. So because we're all equal under the eyes of God. And he was beloved as sort of a Jim Crow abolitionist. And he was incredibly popular with progressive whites and black African Americans. And that never got corrupted or anything. That's just what he did before he moved to California. I think he was from Indiana, I think. But anyway, that's what he did before he moved to California and eventually Guyana. It's just look, this is awful. Racism has no place in the eyes of God. And so it's just like, yeah, I think sometimes people can start out with really good, really positive ideas. And then, once you get on a roll, it's sort of like when you just love the music and then you get famous and you're like, wow, maybe I should do heroin every day. It gets like corrupted or whatever.
I thought you were going to say fuck groupies, but I guess heroin works. Heroin is bad too.
We'd go in different directions, Green. I'd be a drug guy, but maybe you'd be like, oh my God, when this podcast takes off, you're going to be like, you know what I love? Groupies.
That is the goal. No, there's actually a very pressing example in my mind right now why that is a horrible idea, but that is not the conversation for right now.
Sorry, I had too much coffee. So, do you have an idea of like how you want to start this off? I'll throw it over to you if you want.
Yeah, I think a good place to start is, you suggested this, very briefly, let's get into what do you think fascism is? What is the meat of the definition of how do you know if you are looking at a fascist or a non-fascist? Because I think this is partially by design, this is an area of very blurry thinking right now. I'll turn over to you for just a few minutes if you want to start.
Yeah, because that's the contentious thing, right? It's like these people, like, the word gets thrown around very loosely, and sometimes it's equated to, like, a patriot is a fascist, or sometimes it's equated to, like, someone who I guess is like a racist is a fascist, or even someone who's like not for sort of like certain progressive policies is a fascist, which is sort of like ironic when you try to think about like, how monetary systems functioned in certain fascist countries. But what I would say is like fascism, as I understand it, it's about the state serving a specific function within a society in which there are like social values inextricably tied to the idea of the state, and the state is upheld so that those social values can be upheld, and that creates like a unified identity of the citizens within the state. That is, like, as I understand it, the proposition of fascism. That is the idea for like why it would work better than an alternative. And you can read, I mean, there are all these things attributed to like Mussolini, but as I understand it, it's like pretty widely believed that like Giovanni Gentili was sort of Mussolini's like ghostwriter, or ghostwriter rather. It's like Mussolini was like Drake, and then this like Italian philosopher was like the dude behind him who had the bars but didn't like want to get up there to say it. And so it is, as I understand it, like a specific doctrine outlining a relationship between people and the state that would like supposedly reflect kind of like the people's natural self-regulating impulses. So that's like what I think sort of the idea, the elevator pitch or the like startup pitch of fascism is.
That is very, for people who don't know, I read the essay which apparently was ghostwritten by Mr. Giovanni.
Giovanni Gentili.
That was the impetus for me talking about this at all, because it got me stuck on the topic. In there, Mussolini, or rather Giovanni, is extremely
I don't
forward.
know about that, but I think that's what's going on.
In there, they're extremely forward about the state exists to create the nation. And where a liberal democracy tends to more think, oh, it's an organic thing. Liberal democracies tend to assume that you instinctively look back to time immemorial for your sources of meaning, that you bring them to the table preformed. In that essay, it very clearly states, no, nations are fake, or at the very least, they're constructed, so the state will create the nation. And that was actually one of the things that fucking, you know how occasionally you get a little fragment of idea that just fucking, like, changes everything? If I could boil down the sentiment of that essay that really stuck with me, it was this. Yeah, we have realized that nations don't exist by themselves. They are fed into by historical forces, but the state creates the nation. So let's all get together and make a really fucking good one. And that was a connection in my head that it seems almost obvious after you hear it. If you believe the first part, of course you would do the second part.
Yeah, well, that's the thing where it's one of those things, because it's like people often treat fascism as like an idea, and it clearly is an idea, and it clearly is an ideology. But just like, you know, how like Marxists will have like a theory of economics or whatever, it's like that proclamation within fascism. It's not something that I feel like I'm temperamentally agreeing with. I'm like, oh well, that seems inarguably true. That like the state creates the nation. That is like that. It just is what happens, and sort of there's various perspectives you could take on it, but that's not an example of something I would choose to believe. It's like you said, you read that and you're like, oh yeah, that's how it works. Like, it's like, I don't know what to say. It's just, I guess that's something I always understood in like an unarticulated way. And when you hear that, you're like, right. And so I think in any system we create sort of going forward, that would be something we need to keep in mind.
What really struck me with that was I immediately thought about I guess online leftist would be the most conspicuous element of this, but it's almost as if people have realized that a culture is provisional, and so everyone, by these little chip-marky things where they're doing these power games with each other, or they're just fighting and bickering for little bits of cultural capital, piece by piece, they're forming the culture into something where the little pocket they're in might be really comfortable for them. But when you take a step back, it deranges into the shittiest culture that you could have, almost, where everyone in it hates everyone but themselves, and they devote most of their time to bickering. I couldn't help but think, you know, if all these different little groups actively were proactive in trying to make culture, and they tried to make one that was pleasant for everyone and accounted for these things, but didn't result in constant hatred of everyone around you, that might be a sunny interpretation. And I'm not saying actually try this, but to me, it almost seems shocking that they don't try to do this.
Well, yeah, okay, it's like, so are you familiar with Wittgenstein at all?
I don't think so, no.
Oh, so Wittgenstein's a philosopher of the early 20th century, and he was a philosopher of language. He's sort of, you know, probably like the most important linguist maybe ever. And he said this thing once, it's this very famous quote that people have a lot of ideas about, where he said, if a lion could speak, we would not be able to understand it. And sort of the idea of that is that like language it exists in reference to like a familiar experience of existence, right? It exists to refer people to concepts that they're already familiar with. And your lived experience and the experience of a lion are so separate that if somebody like snapped their fingers and imbued a lion with like the ability of English, it still wouldn't be able to like communicate with you at all. And so he's making a point about like how language functions. And I feel like that's a thing that's happening like culturally now in the West, where people, because they have such like separate theories of like how culture functions and what the most important aspect of culture is, and sort of what perspective someone should like hold as prime, that it's very hard with some people to even get to like a starting point. You can't like nail down on like a single shared value from which a conversation could grow. And it's becoming more and more like trying to talk to a lion, where you will, you know what I mean? You'll just anything. It's even hard to understand, but anything that comes from your perspective. Like when I was a kid, I was like, well, everybody will think X. And now that's just been like eroded, where you don't even know if you were to like reach out to someone what your starting place would be. So if we were trying to start a country, it completely makes sense where it's like, there should be like 6 things that we like all agree on. Like it doesn't have to be a long list, but there just needs to be like 3 or 6 ideas that sort of are like the unquestioned like assumptions of the project we're engaged in. Because right now it's like if you were doing a group project with someone, like a paper or something for school, and one person in the group was like, well, I don't think we should do a paper. I think we should dance. And another person was like, I don't think we should even go to school. And another person was like, I think we should all kill ourselves. And then you were like, I think we should write a paper. And it's like getting those 4 people together and trying to have them work on a project seems, that's, you know, when I've had too much coffee and I'm jittery, that's how I think of like political discourse or even pseudo-political discourse in like the modern West.
Yes, I feel like that's very appropriate. With the
Sorry,
language
that
thing,
was like 7 ideas. Go ahead.
No, we're doing good.
Okay.
With the language thing, I feel like really, if you dive into it, you eventually realize it's basically impossible to understand anyone's perspective. On some level, it's even impossible to understand your own perspective while you're having it. And any sort of shared language, there's an element of collaboration, and there's something very provisional about it. And
Yes.
It's interesting to bring up language because so much of the political maneuvering going on today and the accusations of fascism, I think it's not even really about the content of the speech. I don't know, I need a new color beyond red. Infrared? Is there an infrared pill? Around last
so
year.
Cool.
Yeah. I'm just radio waves bursting through the cosmos, the size of the solar system, have been made into a pill, and that's its color that I consume.
Yo, based. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. Around last year, I was reading Nietzsche, and the thing about Nietzsche is you'll only really find meaning in 3 or 4 sentences, but those will change your life. And the thing that really fucking hit me with him was, it is obvious that the reasons for something always come after the decision to do it.
Huh. Okay.
And that, when that happened, something clicked. And over the course of the last year thinking about this, I've really come to believe that a huge amount of things humans say to each other, the speech does not contain information.
I'm listening.
I think that a lot of it has to do with language where it's not what you said, it's that you said. Where, for example, I was thinking about this one the other day. Take the consent discussion.
Sure.
Kind of creepy to bring that up right after the hippie thing, but whatever. Or groupie thing. I was thinking the other day where people were arguing on Twitter, of course, about consent, saying, can a 45-year-old date a 35-year-old, or is that an act of profound evil? People were bringing up the idea, oh, you cannot give consent when you are in this situation where the other person is more powerful than you. And when you think about the concept of consent, that's really not baked in there at all. But what I found myself thinking was, what they really want is consent in general is good is one idea, and it is socially convenient, or we just don't want it to happen for people to date who have an age gap. Those are separate thoughts. But because we are one group, that we operate within shared linguistic structures, we have our own language, I am going to take the concept and the language of consent, bend it around, and find a way to express this separate idea that is related in the language of consent, even though I'm actually taking away agency from the person by doing it.
Yeah.
Where if you're in a political group that defines everything in terms of self-agency, you will use the language of that to actually take agency away from people. And what really matters is everyone that you like is using the same language. The content of what you're saying really almost doesn't matter.
Yeah. That makes sense. That's like, because I don't know how related this is, but I went on a rant yesterday on Twitter about that idea of like red flag books.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and my point was like, it seems like people just want to like sleep with people who read all of the same books as them because they want to make the other person like less of like the part of the equation. Like it's easy to
That's
give
why
yourself...
I'm celibate.
Yeah. It's like easy to give yourself to someone if they seem really, really similar to you, because it's like very analogous to like sort of like the experience of masturbation. And so a lot of the conversations people have these conversations like about words, which is different than like having a conversation about like nature and using words to be expressive of that. People will be like, well, like, you know, I don't know what to say, but when someone's like, well, let's talk about power dynamics. And it's like, well, you know, what, like, when do people feel power dynamics? Is there like a threshold at which power dynamics are reasonable? What does it mean to feel comfortable? Can you tell if there's like a bad power dynamic by like looking at someone? But instead, it just becomes these conversations that take place in a vacuum, having to do with like hypothetical scenarios and whether or not that would like make sense given how we understand the nature of power imbalances. And so everything becomes very dry and almost like a legal text and not like, I don't know what to say. It's just, I don't know if I could say it in a different way than people have conversations about words, which is I think this is sort of similar to what you're saying, kind of like having a conversation about nothing. It's about getting everyone to sort of like agree to certain core concepts just so that there is agreement. And it just like trying to create like a feeling of agreement so that people like feel a sense of tribalism or something. And then the specific thing around which all of that is happening is secondary or like non-essential.
This is going to sound really mean, but a heuristic that has added massively to my life is when people are talking and I feel like the thing in your head that makes you go, oh, I have detected an act of hypocrisy. I am going to own them with facts and logic. When that part of my brain activates, I find myself going, okay, this is what we're going to do. Pretend that you don't speak their language. Actually, pretend that these people are birds and you're hearing bird calls. Does what they're doing make sense better if you imagine them as birds? And I imagine when people go about, this fucking hierarchy is bad, this is offensive, this is that. When they do that, I imagine them as chirping birds in a tree, signaling the fact that they are friendly to each other or that there is the presence of a predator. And that heuristic holds up a massive amount of the time, Zombie.
That kind of makes sense. Yeah, it's I don't know what to say, dude. It's if we're going to function as a nation, we can't be like this conglomerate of like 120 different like very fringe political ideas. It's too complicated, and then all we're doing is like sorting out the noise. And
no, but we could be an empire.
You think so?
Which is what we're doing. I completely believe we're reverting back to like an imperial structure where the elites have their own language and own values. It's actually good to bring that up because, sorry, I guess I'm bowling over you. One thing that stuck with me is, you know the word fascism, you know where it comes from?
Fascism. You're going to tell me. Go ahead.
I am. It comes from ancient Rome, where you see the symbol, I think it's pronounced a fasces, where it's a bundle of sticks with an axe in the middle. That's the great symbol of fascism.
Okay.
That was a symbol of authority in ancient Rome. The concept of fascism comes from Rome, but one thing that makes fascism in ancient Rome so different than fascism now is fascism was almost like Bushido, or chivalry. It was always understood as something that the elites have their own culture, and the elites can be these warmongers that are hyper-conservative, hyper-collectivist, extremely militaristic, and to an extent that does bleed down to the regular people, but Rome never pretended to be a nation. They were always very cognizant of, we conquer a people, we get their elites into the system with our elites, the lower people, they'll retain a lot of cultural distinctiveness just as a matter of course because it's the ancient world. And one thing that makes modern fascism so different than that is modern fascism is democratic. If you're in Italy in the 20th century, you can actually get everyone listening to the same media, going to the same rallies, wearing the same clothes, and it can't just be, it stops being just a top-level elite thing, it's going down. And I guess my point with that is, I think that might actually be changing because the media environment is changing now.
Changing in what sense? In like the idea of elite culture is being reintroduced?
I guess in a way that kind of works, where I kind of jumped around there, I suppose. But one thing that I was thinking about with 20th century fascism is that was an era, kind of the McLuhan thing, the media is the message. That was an era where people in the same nation read national newspapers and listened to national broadcasts, and a bit later they watched national TV shows. We're kind of past that now, where media is very fractured again, even if it's now global. So that kind of changes the situation with fascism, where I don't know if you could do 20th century fascism now, because having everyone consuming the same media in the same nation was probably part of the foundation for that.
Wow, yeah, that is an interesting idea, right? That is an interesting idea for sure, because it's like okay, here's an example, not to get too into it, because we are talking about fascism, and I'm going to talk about the Jews, but like the American government is very like pro-Israel, right? They're like, Israel are our allies. We trade with Israel. We give aid to Israel. Like there's like an exchange of money and services. But there's all sorts of people in America who are very anti-Israel. And it's like this whole gamut, you know what I mean? It's like the Nick Fuentes, like Groyper right-wing guys, like they really hate Israel. And then, the far-left humanitarians, like the Palestinian people are like being kept in an open-air prison people. Like they really hate Israel. And so it's this idea where it's like the government is like very pro this thing. And then the citizenry who are kind of not united on anything else, both disagree with the government in this one way. And so it's hard to sort of identify anything that the government is doing that the citizenry then en masse like accepts as something that's good. Like I can't think of like a single example where that is really happening.
And I'm actually wondering if it might simply be over in that sense. In the sense that if you don't have the information structure lined up in that way, you can probably do a much worse version of fascism with the internet. I'm just not sure what it would look like.
Okay, well, this is good. This will feed into a thing I wanted to talk about. Because if you were to say, if you, Green, were like, look, fascism's like impossible. It actually can't happen. We don't have to be afraid of it. Like, read Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message. We're not in a place where this can exist because like this sort of the propaganda machine is not like effective enough to really make that happen. We've shifted into like a different phase of propaganda or whatever. If you were to say that, both, whatever you would call them, like in my opinion, small fringe of like radical right people who exist, and sort of like the left-wing spectrum of people who like fight against fascism or fear it, would be mad at you for separate reasons. It's like this thing, fascism, exists as something to be struggled against for people who want to struggle against something. And they've identified it as this because obviously historically like fascism is very scary. And so people have made this point before, but it's just obvious that people are insisting that this thing is like a real and true threat because they define themselves as people who are like struggling against it. And it does speak to people's psychological state to imagine a scenario in which you were like, look, we can't even do fascism. The internet the internet is Antifa. It's like made it impossible. They would be upset with you because fascism or Nazi, as those words are used or are defined currently, serve like a psychological function for millions of people. They are meaning making. They like imbue the lives. The idea that we should resist fascism imbues the lives of millions of people with purpose. And so that's, I think, part of why the definition has become so nebulous. It's like this thing that people really, really fear and insist they hate. They're absolutely attached to the idea that it like does exist. It like exists and is sort of like they're defeating it, but also they would be sad if it ever went away.
Let's get into that. That seems like a good thing. Let's talk about meaning, because one thing that really strikes me about fascism is I think that probably the defining feature of fascism is that it really directly and brutally and severely goes directly for the sense of meaning.
Yes.
Where we talked earlier about the definition of fascism, what is it really? It reminded me to something I heard in college where I had multiple teachers that were into this for some reason. I took an intro political economy class, and one thing that really stuck with me was they put the political spectrum, the really simplified one, not the meme one with the 4D compass, on the board. And they basically said, as you go right towards Adam Smith, you get more individualistic. As you go left towards Marx, you get more collectivist. But both Adam Smith and Marx, if you ask them, they would justify their views with the claim, this is basically about prosperity. This is about economic innovation. This is about developing systems that humans can live in. Adam Smith says if you tolerate inequality, the prosperity will go up so much in general that we're all better off financially. Marx said,
a rising tide lifts all ships, right? Oh, I was just going to say a rising tide
exactly
lifts all
that.
ships. Okay.
Exactly that. Marx said, no, that's not true. The inequality is so bad that we would actually be better off just having a clean slate system, and that would increase prosperity that way. And a really annoying thing about current leftists is the Green Party and environmentalism got lumped in with them. Traditional Marxism is very into economic development. That's something that gets lost in the conversation now. And both of these things on the spectrum, they assume that the goal of politics is to add prosperity to everyone's life, mostly materially. Fascism completely breaks this paradigm by saying, no, this is about emotional validation. This is about the fight. This is about meaning. This is about projecting our spirit onto the world and destroying our enemies and building a great people. Where I think the thing that really defines fascism is it completely undermines, it's weird to call Marxism mainstream, it completely undermines mainstream politics by saying the fight and that feeling you get in your bones when you think about slaying your enemies, that's what government is about. It's about the feeling in your bones.
Well, okay, that's great that you bring that up, because that feeds into so many things I want to talk about. Like, first of all, there is a thing that's happening right now where people are like fundamentally sort of misunderstanding themselves. Because when you talk about the axis between like individualism and like collectivism, there's no, like, people are theoretically pushing for like collectivism, right? Like, people in the United States want like, like nationalized healthcare, right? And they're pro workers' rights or whatever. And like Jacobin, which is like the magazine of the Democratic Socialists of America, is like this, like essentially pro-union, like workers' rights magazine. But people are defining themselves as a person. They're like, I am a Marxist-Leninist. That is what I am doing. Who I am is this ideology. And then, there was that video of the DSA meeting where that guy was basically crying, telling people like not to clap their hands because it hurt people who have like, did you see that? It like hurts people who have like sensitivity to like loud sounds. And so, and like Radio and I went to an Antifa protest in Toronto where it was like, I don't know, 100 like Antifa people squared off against this like small group of right-wing protesters who were mad about some bill that was supposed to protect Muslims from discrimination or whatever. And then a whole bunch of Proud Boys showed up, and then a bunch of cops got in the middle. And we just sat and watched for like 45 minutes as like the Proud Boys sort of stood there and smoked and tried to look cool. And all of the Antifa people, it was almost like they were speaking in tongues. They went on these like sort of performative rants about like the nature of the world, but they weren't all like paying attention to each other. It wasn't this organized collectivist thing at all. It was just like a whole bunch of people screaming about like what needs to happen in the world, but they weren't talking to each other. They were just shouting at this crowd of, I don't know, however many people, like 300 or 400 people, including me, who had just stood there to like stop and watch them. So it is so ironic now that, like, I guess the thing you can't reject about fascism, where they're like, it's like that thing you said, where it's like, look, no, government, the state, the idea of the nation is about the feeling of crushing one's enemies, because all of these people are claiming to be collectivists, but they're resisting any kind of, like, collectivization, because the function it serves is very individualistic. It's very internal and personal and psychological.
There's actually, there's a fun quote about that where I think it was Lao Tzu, the Taoist guy, was talking to a Confucian, and he asked the Confucian what his principles were, and the Confucian said, duty to society and rejection of the self. And Lao Tzu said, that's bullshit. Your rejection of the self is a positive manifestation of self. It is like going after a fugitive with a drum, where the plan might be collectivist, but every single person participating in it is really trying to feed their ego and their own desires, which is kind of a problem with things like Marxism, because it usually attracts that, where it's a shell game with different layers.
Yeah. People's psychology like fundamentally doesn't change, right? Because like
no,
if you read The Road to Wigan Pier by George Orwell, which is a book that I like really like.
I've read it.
You've read it. So that part where he talks about how the problem with socialism is socialists, and he says something like, one gets the impression that the very utterance of the word socialism brings along with it every like healthcare quack, feminist, vegan, sandal wearer, like sex freak, witch doctor, And he just names like all of these weird niches of people, and then he's in the end of it, it's like this whole big paragraph, like freak in all of England, and that's like sort of that's a point he raises where he's like, you know, what we sort of envisioned with socialism was like a bunch of men in greasy overalls demanding better conditions for themselves, and what you get is just every person who's like an outsider deciding that like collectivism is their thing, even though they're all of these random people who don't have anything to do with each other. And that book's from 1937, so that's 88 years or something like that. That's like, or 84 years ago. It's the same. That like that problem has materially not changed at all. Where there's something about collectivism that draws toward it anyone who's like an individualist who does not like identify with the current status quo.
It's really frustrating because I myself have become one of those people. I've sort of became a George Orwell leftist where I don't see myself as a leftist at all. I'm an extremely pragmatic person who simply believes we have to address inequality somewhat or the whole ship is going to collapse and take us with it.
Sure.
But it seems almost impossible to do that. And I think part of this, and I think part of what plays into the fascism thing is I think humans have this impulse, or at least socialized humans in a post-civilization part of life. I don't fucking know. Maybe hunter-gatherers don't have this, where humans are very afraid to leave what you could call a vertically integrated groups, where a big problem with Marx is the working class in England always identified with the nobility and the upper class of England way more than the working class in Germany or Russia. And Marx's career was basically constant frustration at that fact. And I think this is because humans have this thing in them where they sense that a certain sort of social organization is stable and resilient and it's not going to break. Yeah. Where the fact that every society follows this pattern probably means there's a lot of forces pushing it into that. And the moment you equalize everything, you get, basically what I believe is you get this first mover problem, where if you establish equality, the people who have power and or could have power within the new equal group, they can look at each other, cut out a smaller subgroup of that society and go, if we only care about ourselves, we can end up back on top. And they'll probably start doing it.
Yeah, well, it's the idea that people don't compete. Like, that's the most innate thing in the world, right? You're never going... Yeah. Obviously, you can introduce for the betterment of all, like, taxes or some sort of, like, redistributive mechanism. But the idea, it's like, when you flatten something, it unflattens. Right? Like, that's just... It seems insane to me that you could, like, ever absolutely resist that. And so it's like, you know, you can teach people to be compassionate. You can encourage people to be charitable or to sort of participate in, like, you know, non-charitable redistributive wealth problems, like just not be that upset about being taxed at whatever percentage they're taxed. But, you know, you're never going to get people not to compete with each other. And certainly much more, you know, right-leaning people would say that that's a terrible idea and we should like absolutely try not to have that happen. So I think you're absolutely right, because I don't know how do I explain this? Like, okay, you want to talk about Nazis for a sec?
Sure.
We don't have to.
Oh, that was actually a question. We can talk about Nazis, and the competition thing, this is actually going to get very weird now. The competition thing, I was going to say, it's not just humans. Every living cell on the planet competes with another living organism.
Yeah.
That's just in the nature of life. That's not even... And a thing about Nazis is... Hitler said many, many times, well, fuck, it wasn't just Hitler. Nazi leaders said many times, it was actually arguably their defining characteristic, National Socialism is just applied biology.
Yeah.
Where they looked at their conception of Darwinian forces and said, okay, we're going to very consciously and proactively engage in this. And we can argue about whether or not that was a coherent understanding of Darwinism, but that was their idea. Competition is inherent to life. Let's make competition everything, which I think is also part of fascism. It's making competition the point rather than something that happens incidentally.
Right. Okay, right. Yeah, yeah. So that's perfect because like very
But Nazis,
often,
we're talking Nazis.
no, that's okay. That's related because like this idea that like we have to smash fascism, right? There's people they have those like flags on their shirt or whatever. I really don't understand like the Antifa messaging that much, but this idea that like we have to smash fascism. It's like, well, the way I think that you would like smash fascism, if you think of it as some sort of like rot or like disease or like at least Nazism was, would be to avoid the conditions that like brought it into being, that like made it flourish. And so it's so interesting to me that people are like very concerned with like the atrocities of fascism and very unconcerned with like, okay, well, what was going on in Germany in like 1919, 1920, 1921 up until like 19 sort of 27 or 8 when like Hitler really begins to seem like more of an inevitability, because it's like if you look at the people who supported like the Nazi Party, it's a whole bunch of people who like really didn't seem to like Hitler that much, viewed him as sort of like an intermediary or something that would happen temporarily, and also people who like weren't particularly anti-Semitic, or at least no more anti-Semitic than people were in Russia or whatever. I'm not going to say, people, there's sort of always been like too much anti-Semitism in the world, but if you look
Why can't we all just love each other?
Yeah, exactly. If you look at that, there's like an incredible amount of like rich business owners who like very reserved people, like uptight, sort of aristocratic professional people who were like, no, given the current circumstances, it makes sense to support the Nazi Party because the alternative is like Bolshevismus, which is like Bolshevism, like whatever's happening in Russia for the past 5 years that like will make its way into Germany, and this guy is like the response to that. So at least in like the worst possible test case of like fascism existing in the history of the world, it was something that was like chosen and pushed for by presumably pragmatic people who were like frightened of like an extreme left-wing case. And it's the same thing with Pinochet in Chile, where it was like they were doing Marxism, they had like a left-wing redistributive government, and Pinochet is like, what we're just going to do is like an isolationist economy, and everybody's going to make things for each other, and you won't be able to get it from like outside, and that will lift us all. And then also I'm going to, throw political dissonance out of helicopters or whatever he did. And so it's like the material conditions that have caused this to arise, or even if you look at Mussolini, who was like a dissatisfied socialist, like a dissatisfied leftist who were like, I can't fucking get anything done because I can't get anybody to cooperate with each other. So this is like my new idea. The material conditions for it was always a reaction against people sort of like being dissatisfied with or afraid of something that could be described as leftism or socialism or like this redistributive thing. But what you have happening now in like America and Britain and Canada is this idea that like the way we fight against fascism is by demanding that people sort of subscribe to these progressive policies that like make all of them uncomfortable. And it's just, I mean, I'm not a genius. I don't understand how the whole world works, but it seems like these people are bringing into being like the very thing that they are like ostensibly fighting against. It's the oddest scenario I've ever seen. Like nothing has contributed more to like the rise in the popularity of like extreme right-wing values than the existence of anti-fascists, and that just seems like a historical cycle repeating itself.
It's actually kind of terrifying, where it seems like extreme leftism, you actually could think of its primary purpose for existing as being a midwife of extreme far-right politics.
That's great. Yeah. Fuck. I said about 1,000 words to get there, but that does seem to be the case, right? Like the people who supported Hitler were the people who were less afraid of Hitler than they were of like some alternative in which they had like everything stripped from them or given away. Or, because there were in like, 1920, 1921, 1922 Germany, like leftist governments that came into place. I think the government changed hands like 6 times in 3 years, under which there was like instability and all sorts of political assassinations. And so people were just like, looking for an antidote to something like this. It wasn't something that like grew out of like a stable democracy because everyone got brainwashed. But people, and again, I don't mean to seem like a genius, people have no concept of history. They really think it's like possible.
No, they fucking don't. They only know Hitler, and they don't even know Hitler.
Yeah, they really think it's possible that we're going to move from this place of like, you know, like the American government in a way is designed to function slowly, right? That is the point. Like the founding fathers had that in mind, where they're like, change will happen, but change will happen slowly to create stability. And people think that like out of that environment, like an extreme rightism is the thing that will grow, even though that's, I mean, as far as I can tell, never happened in, you know, at least since the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, in America, we've had many moments of right-wing populism. They never spiraled into fucking insanity. It was, we did it for 10 years and it slowly edged back the other way. That's generally how it goes. It was like that in the 30s fucking here, when a lot of people here were flirting with fascism. It never took root, but it was there. One thing, we're talking about the difference between, we're talking about leftism being a midwife for rightism. One thing that is so interesting about fascism is I feel like it really plays into the weaknesses of the other two big ideologies, where you have liberalism, you have Marxism, you have fascism. Marxism can't work. Like, Marxism is just a mental illness. There's nothing...
We had this like pretense of like intellectuality to what we were doing, and I love that you've just been like, these people are out of their fucking minds, which I also encourage, by the way. But it's, you know,
I have a whole theory, actually. This is a conversation for another day. I have a theory that because I see humans as biological systems, I see ideas as biological systems. I think that Marxism is actually the slack in the system of the economy, of where the elites have more resources than they need. I think that causes like a biological freak out inside humans that notice it, in a way where it's like there's a pile of resources that's not being used. And I think I think the subconscious will actually strip information out of your mind until you're fucking jazzed up enough to go for it. I think it's totally like just like a freak out that's not even supposed to work. It's just supposed to make you go for it. That's a conversation for another day, though. Marxism.
So you think it's like if there's a bunch of potatoes on the other side of a wall, or like some sort of food, and you can like smell it, and then you just get this like hunger that removes like so many ideas from your mind because you understand that like something delicious is on the other side of a wall.
Imagine if there are potatoes on the other side of a minefield.
Okay.
As you get hungrier, you would start muttering to yourself, and you would start ignoring information that would convince you not to go for it. And you would eventually get to the part where it's like, you know, a bunch of those, they look more like rocks than mines. I bet they're actually duds. They were made by Bulgaria, I bet. They probably don't even explode. The idea, it would be your subconscious talking you into doing it out of desperation. It would never actually be a good plan.
Nice.
The difference is fascism actually works. Or it at least can work for a while. Where it's basically like this. This is an idea that I love, where I was talking vertically integrated groups versus horizontal groups. Imagine if me, you, and radio are in a room.
Okay.
And our livers become aware of each other's livers, and our livers start talking to each other and going, God, the brain and the heart and the lungs get so much nutrition. We should rebel against them to get more for ourselves. That's Marxism. Now imagine if your entire body walked over to radio's entire body, looked over at Green and said, you know, we could kill Green and we could eat him. That's not a good idea, but you could actually do that one. That's how I view the difference.
I see what you're saying. One is like a partially destructive force, and the other is like an all-consuming destructive force.
Yeah, where one has virtually no chance of actually working, the other is a really bad idea, but will at least can do something before it fails. But the idea I was getting to with this is the vertically integrated group thing, where you have leaders, people in the middle, and the bottom, and then you look at other vertically integrated groups and fight them. I think fascism actually overcomes, or at least tries to overcome, some of the problems with the other systems, where the whole thing with Marxism is once you break away from that classic social structure of a few leaders, workers, and, people in the middle who mediate, once you break away from that, humans get really antsy and, the system becomes unstable because there's just so much going on, and it creates a lot of opportunity for people to break away from the plan. And another part that has become more important recently is if there are weak boundaries around those groups, the benefits of economic activity can flow out or float in. For example, if you have migrant workers that will work for almost nothing that can continually come in, that is going to at least potentially reduce the amount of rewards that the current workers get as growth happens. And part of the thing is with fighting other groups and redistributing, if all the workers fight all the people at the top of society and redistribute the wealth downward, there's all this instability and potential for shit. But if a vertically integrated group, if just like one nation destroys another nation and takes their shit, you still have the intact social structure of your nation.
Have you ever seen that movie Looper?
I have not.
It's fine.
I'm very curious to see where this goes.
It's fine. It's an okay movie. It's kind of about time travel. It's like sort of confusing. I don't know. You could watch Primer or Back to the Future or fucking Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure if you wanted a good time travel movie. But anyway, there's a part in Looper I really like where I'll try to explain this as quickly as I can. Jeff Daniels is from the future, and he's in the past supervising people who have like been hired by people in the future to sort of like execute a specific task. That's all the information you need to know. So okay. You got that? Jeff Daniels is like in X year, and he is Joseph Gordon-Levitt's boss, and he's from the future, and he's like, these people in the past work for him, and he's sort of like a middle manager from the future, right? And so Joseph Gordon-Levitt quits his job, and Jeff Daniels is like, what are you going to do? And Joseph Gordon-Levitt's like, I don't know. I always wanted to learn French. Maybe I'll move to Paris. And Jeff Daniels goes, maybe you should move to China. And then Joseph Gordon-Levitt's like, I think I'll, backpack around Europe for a while. And then there's a very serious moment where Jeff Daniels looks at him and he goes, I am from the future. You should move to China. And that is his way of being like, there's information that I have that I am not supposed to tell you about like what the year I come from looks like. And just like, I'm kind of breaking protocol right now. Listen to me. And that was that one part in that like mostly dumb movie made by a director who had potential and then really disappointed me. I'm sure not that Rian Johnson gives a fuck, but that was that one part in that movie where I was like, that's brilliant. That makes so much sense, because it does seem to be the case where it's like there's this giant nation on the earth that has sort of decided, I think it's fair to say this, just to prioritize itself over all other nations. Like,
yeah, it's China, pretty easy to say that.
Yeah, China is like out for China. I saw this interview with Jackie Chan that was in whatever they speak, like Shanghainese or like Mandarin Chinese, where he was like, of course we can criticize China, but we have to do that like internally in secret. And then whenever I'm in the West, like promoting a movie, all I say is that China is the best, because that is like our responsibility to China, is to make China seem great to the world. And then home behind closed doors, we have all of these little conversations about like things we could do to make China better. But to the world, China is the greatest country on earth. And so he's, he's effectively like a propaganda agent for the government of China, right? Because he's like a movie star. It's like what Tom Cruise represents for Scientology, or what like, I don't know, whomever, I don't know who the film stars under Goebbels were, but like whatever they represented for Nazi Germany. And so I just think it's like, I mean, people talk about like how we need to quote unquote like smash fascism, but it's like China is doing that. That's the opinion of China. They're doing something that's like approximating a genocide right now. And I haven't talked to anyone who's like, oh, they're going to lose, right? Like Woody Guthrie has that. I think it's Woody Guthrie. It might be that guy who sings Your Land Is Our Land. No, I think it's Woody Guthrie. where he says, "All you fascists are bound to lose," and he sings that on his guitar with that, like, "This machine kills fascists" written on it.
I've seen that guitar.
Oh, like
or one of them. I went to Museum of Pop Culture. They have one of his guitars.
Right, yeah. So he has that song where he sings, "All you fascists are bound to lose," and it's like, wow, not the ones in China though. Like
No.
It kind of seems like everything they're doing is like going to work, and that they like will succeed. And it's so interesting that, like, because I'll put on my MAGA hat here for a while to see if I can make anybody mad. It's sort of interesting that, like, Trump, who was like, look, China is killing us. We are getting like screwed on all these trades. I'm going to like start a trade war with China. We need to make them more equitable to us for things to be good in the long term. That guy who took that position, who was like, China's being like sneaky and shifty and we need to watch them and it's bad for America and it's not good. He was the person who was called the fascist maybe more than anyone in history. Trump was probably called the fascist in print, definitely more than Hitler. Way more than Hitler. He crushes Hitler's like being called the fascist number. So the guy who took the anti-China position was accused of the thing that China is like effectively doing, and that like definitely contributed to like him not being reelected, like for sure. And so when you make the case about like how it is sort of like a good strategy for one nation of people to like commit to vertical integration and then compete against other vertically integrated groups of people, it's like that is on some level the game that is being played, right? That's what nation states do effectively, is like to compete against each other. And there's like rules and everything, but China is the country that is being most honest about the fact that like that is actually what is happening in the world. That is how the world operates. And I'm sure like if Jeff Daniels came back and he's like, "I'm from the future, you should move to China," I'd be like, I know, yes, we should all move to China.
And that actually is a great jumping off point. You're being very charitable with me. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
That is a good jumping off point, where the problem with liberalism is that it sucks.
Okay.
It just makes you feel bad about yourself to participate in it sometimes. Where
Sure,
the weird
yes.
thing is, Western liberalism, it seems pretty reliable at providing a better quality of life for people than basically any other system. But like, it makes you a worse person to be there with it.
Huh. Okay. I'm on board so far.
Okay, good. Time to go to China. The thing with Western liberalism is you brought up the double talk, where I've kind of come to believe people have different language systems for talking to outsiders and talking to insiders. Remember that bird chirping thing?
Yeah.
I think if you're talking about practical issues with people that you genuinely believe to be in cooperation with you, I think then your language actually does contain meaning. I think the words you say do translate to the real world. But when you are yelling at a group that you perceive as an outgroup, it almost never has any reality to it whatsoever. It's about posturing and reminding people who the enemy is. And the thing is, with liberalism, we take all these different groups, put them together, have them talk to each other, which means that almost everything we hear is a lie. Where everyone participating, they save their honest speech for when they're around their bedfellows, at least stereotypically. I know not everyone is the same level of this. Yeah, they reserve their honest speech for their people, and then they get in the public, and when they are running the show, they are lying most of the time. Or at the very least, they're putting on a show. And then we look at all the corruption, where, in a way, voting is a form of corruption, I think. Where every single person participating has their vision of this is what's right. And rather than fighting it out over what's right, they get together and they vote. But voting only makes sense if it's a secondary effect of you doing what is right. I think it's a good thing to have restraint with putting your vision on the world. That's fair. But in a way, it is a form of corruption. It is you giving up what you believe in your heart to be right for the sake of convenience. And the problem with liberalism is eventually the corruption becomes the point. If you believe that voting is the point, that voting is a good in and of itself, you have drank the Kool-Aid, you believe that people not doing what they think is right is inherently good. And we've gotten to a point in America where the whole political machine is just about corruption now. It's about telling lies. It's about taking money that's supposed to go towards one thing or the other and shuffling it towards your group. It's about voting. One of the angriest times I've been recently is I did not vote this year. I came to the conclusion, you know what? Until we make them fucking work for the vote, it means nothing. I give up. And everyone who argued with me, I didn't meet a single person who seemed to believe that we lived in a real democracy. I met a lot of people who knew that democracy in America is bullshit right now, but were still mad that I didn't vote. Because voting has become the point. The idea that voting is actually serving a purpose doesn't even occur to them.
Yeah. I think I would effectively agree with all of that. Like, it's like, not to be a Bernie bro about it, but just the idea that, like, that man, Bernie Sanders, who represents, like, the, sort of the counterpoint to Donald Trump, the biggest, like, or maybe not ideological, but certainly, like, policy-wise difference from Donald Trump of, like, any serious candidate in the mainstream politics, has never debated that man one time, right? Like, if we were writing a novel and they were characters, or we were sort of like in a village where everything didn't have to function based on all of this fucked bureaucracy, those men would get on stage together and debate ideas. And we never got to a place where that could happen. And it is existentially completely unsatisfying that was not an event in history. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense. And if that were, because I think of everything as narratives, I mean, I guess everybody does, but I try to be aware of it. If this were like in a book, then the book would be about how the system is fucked. Like, it would be a book about everyone getting cucked. And the fact that debate didn't occur. It's ridiculous that those men weren't able to sort of, perform in front of people and allow people to, in this ceremonial way, like, see how they, as public speakers and policymakers, like, operated in difference to each other. They've never talked one time. And
the fact that they didn't talk is okay, because we voted.
Yeah.
The fact that we had the election and no one questioned the logic of what was going on, that's locked away. It's officially okay. 2 wolves and a sheep had a vote over what to have for dinner, and because there was a vote, we're all fine. About the, you brought up Chyna. Chyna's a good person to bring up, and I think this is...
Well, Chyna's not a person.
Wait, what?
You said Chyna is a good person to bring up.
Oh, there's the wrestler Chyna with a Y.
Oh, yeah, that's who we're talking about. We're talking about the wrestler
dead.
Chyna. And yeah, rip Chyna. That's a good. I mean, I'm not trying to control your show. That's a good title for this app, Rip Chyna, and then
that actually could be.
We're at Chyna's funeral.
But about Chyna, part of the thing with Chyna is this mentality of trusting the leaders. Just whether or not they really do, at least performatively, it's assumed that the leaders have our best intentions at heart, let them do their thing, and whatever, we'll judge it later. And there's a few things about that really stick with me. I got very sidetracked where I was talking about the advantages fascism, or I guess really intense authoritarianism at least, have over other systems. One is with Marxism. If you have a really intense sense of identity, the ways that gains for a certain class will trickle out, there is a bit of a border stopping that. And one thing about liberalism is it always annoys us that our leaders don't really follow the plan. They don't do what we want them to do. The idea is, we can police them. We can monitor their actions. We can punish them by voting and with the court of law. But it's so hard to monitor human beings, especially someone so much more powerful than you, that outside of extreme cases, that doesn't really happen so well. The beautiful thing, probably shouldn't say beautiful, the interesting thing about authoritarianism and really intense identitarian governments like Chyna is if you believe from the outset that your leaders and you have the same interests, or that by pursuing their own interest, the leaders will pursue yours, you don't have to monitor them. Whether or not they're following the plan doesn't fucking matter, because you can just trust them to be acting in your interest, whether or not you're even paying attention.
Okay, so that's very interesting, because that brings me to two separate ideas. The first of which is I've talked to a few British people who still to this day are like monarchists. They're like, the royal family should run everything. Parliament should have like basic like bureaucratic and like sort of legislative abilities, but like the royal family should be much more involved with how the United Kingdom and the British Empire functions, and that's better because they think that like it makes sense to have a figurehead who sort of functions as like the face of your country and is representative of your values, because their idea is that creates, at least within the country, all sorts of like internal stability. So you don't have like all of the energy that's wasted on like trying to make a functioning democracy and everybody arguing about this stuff. It's just like there is the monarchy and then people are behind them, and that creates this like internal stability and sort of just as like an existential result of that, this cooperation. And now I don't know if I agree with that, but until I met a few people who were monarchists, I never even thought about that. I never even thought, I was just like, a queen? That's like dumb. Like a king? Like that's old, like medieval thinking. It doesn't make any sense, until they made an argument for it. And then I was like, well, I can sort of see how this is compelling. And then there's a separate part of that, which is this idea. Do you know from The Zone, like Space Lions, Andrew J. Wilson?
I know of them through Haynes. I've never spoken to them.
When the whole Epstein thing happened, right? He was like, I don't know who did this, which means I don't know who is actually running the country. Because the people who can have people, I mean, I don't know how you feel about Epstein.
That is fucking beautiful.
Yeah, seems like he was murdered in prison. And he was like, the people who can murder people in prison are the people who are in charge of the country. And I don't know who that is, which means that this whole thing is fucked. Because if we had a king and the king fucked up hard enough, we could all go kill him, right? We know where he lives. He lives in the palace. We could march up the hill with a pitchfork and we could murder him, and then he would be dead, and we'd be like, okay, what's the plan now? But now, and it's so funny, he's like driving in his car like through the desert of Arizona, just angry, and he's like, I don't even know who to kill.
Oh my God, I have thought that about corporations so many fucking times.
Yeah.
Where the whole problem with them is that there's no accountability. So even if they do something completely evil, where the victims, by all logic, should kill who did it, there's no one to kill.
Yeah. It's like, there's not the man Enron. I can't like murder Enron the dude. And even if you find, the board who ran it, it's not like any individual. They just sort of entered into this like dark collaboration where everybody fucked up. It's sort of like a tragedy on all sides or something. And so this idea that like, obviously the best system is to have all of these leaders we elect and have their campaigns financed by companies that have like boards of directors. And that is how we will get to a place where like the interests of the people sort of like are represented. It's like, I can kind of see that, right? Like, I get it, 1776, you wanted to found a nation, you like had a constitution or whatever. But now when you look at where this ends up, it's like, what if we just had a king? And it was like his job to like represent our values, and we just like trust. It's like you said, where if you have elites who have like are similar to you and you know who they are and you trust that they represent your values, then you can, it's like you can go on with your day. Like there's that Zizek quote where he says, I don't like care whether I live in like a communist country or like a parliamentary republic, as long as when I turn on my faucet, clean water comes out of the tap. And the moment that doesn't happen, then I become like a political activist. And so that's sort of a good point where it's like, look, if things are functioning correctly, it might make more sense to have like an identifiable figurehead who's in charge of everything. Maybe, but there is now just this like de facto assumption that like obviously the best system is like, big government socialism with all sorts of like elected leaders in which there is like endless debate and bureaucracy. Like people are taking as granted that that's a good idea. And it's like, I don't know, sort of, maybe we could just have a king. Maybe like just think about it. I never thought about it. Just think about it.
Yeah, and it's because it's if the king is doing the right thing, then corruption and them being authoritarian, it's them sweeping aside barriers to them doing the right thing. So
Yeah.
you never in the kingdom of God, we would not have laws. I will say, I'm now going to quote Deus Ex because we hit Deus Ex at multiple points. When I was prepping for this yesterday, I remembered my favorite Deus Ex quotes. There's a part in Deus Ex where J.C. Denton goes into a fucking bar and the bartender just drops red pills like crazy, talking about how great Chyna is. J.C. Denton is defending the rule of law and constitutions and these checks and balances. And the bar guy says, a society organized around the weakest qualities of its leaders will surely inspire those qualities in its people. Where if you have this defensive approach to human organization where virtue doesn't matter nearly so much as curbing people's flaws, everything is going to be about people's flaws. And they also said the West, so afraid of big government, now has no government at all, only financial institutions. So that's less relevant. I just like that.
Yeah. No, it's an excellent point. It's a good way to think. It's I don't know what to say. Like, this is insane, and I do not think that we should do.
Oh, I'll make
fascism.
it more insane before we leave. Please go.
Okay. I do not think that we should do fascism. But, like, you remember a few weeks ago when fucking Texas froze?
Yes.
Yeah. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was like, well, if we had done the Green New Deal, this wouldn't have happened. Like, Texas would have been good. And then other people said no because of this evidence. And there were all of these arguments over whether or not, like if America had gone Green New Deal and moved more towards like large scale renewable energy engineering projects in like 2016 or whenever she came up with it, whether or not Texas would have frozen over. And it's like, no, like what happened is like roughly 7 people fucked up and Texas's like power system failed, and we should just find them and fire them all. Like that's how that works. It's like there were a certain subsection of incompetent people who their job was to keep power on in Texas and they didn't do it. And getting to this place where like when something bad happens, rather than being action oriented, politicians talk about how everything would have been fine if their opponents hadn't fucked up their plan 2 years ago, which is like so divorced from the idea of leadership, it's insane. Not only is it not about like this is what we're going to do now to fix this, it's not even about it's not even about necessarily what happened. It's not even about having empathy. It's a way of talking about yourself. It's a way of being like, all of these people wouldn't have been fine, like would have been fine if, you know, like the Senate hadn't gone against me in the past or whatever, or if like Republicans didn't hold any power or just whatever idea it is. And so it's like the reaction of, and I don't mean to single out AOC, even though I, you know, fucking hate her. There's like
do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who are like this, where it's like when talking about politics, they talk about like themselves, right? Like the idea of like, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, has shifted to be like, I want to do things for my country, but like the other side is stupid. And
okay,
so
you now. Oh, sorry, Ken.
No, go ahead.
That's it. Okay, you now triggered a good point. Real quick, I'll just say, if you imagine AOC as a bird who made a chirping sound saying, oh, these people are bad, and the birds that speak the same bird language as AOC went chirp, 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 they sure are bad, and went back to I mean, you know, you could do it. You could treat humanity with contempt and, you know, be a cool podcaster guy. You could do it. But you just quoted Kennedy, and I was actually thinking about Kennedy while you were fucking talking, because a thing about democracy is people have been saying this forever. I forget who. I think it's probably Thucydides. But people for a very long time have said democracies really live or die by the qualities of the exceptional individuals who arise as leaders within them. Where when it gets bogged down in nothing but lowest common denominator, they become really self-destructive and stagnant. But if there's a visionary person, it can work. And a few things about American democracy, a lot of our most visionary, energetic presidents were people who were either presidents almost by accident, or they were people who came from a very non-democratic background in ways. Where, for example, Teddy Roosevelt, he was put in the office of the vice presidency basically to shut him up because his party was kind of annoyed with him. They thought, okay, you go be vice president, you'll sit there for 4 years, we'll be fucking done with you. And he ended up president almost by accident, and he was insanely visionary. Kennedy, who you just quoted, and FDR, who we mentioned the New Deal, or the Green New Deal, but the New Deal. Both Kennedy and FDR came out of the aristocratic East Coast families that their values and their class mentality had a lot more in common than with old European nobility, at least transplanted into the American version of it, than anything else. And they had these very heroic ideas that they were leaders of men that spoke visionary things and all that. There are some rough examples. I mean, Eisenhower and Grant were both mediocre presidents, even though they were military leaders. It seems like when a democracy gets a really good leader, a lot of times it's almost in spite of the process than because of it. Lincoln as well. Lincoln was very much an accidental president. He was a nobody who just the quirk of demographics made him a candidate for uniting a coalition, and then he did the Cooper Union speech and fucking everyone loved him. Also an accidental president. When we get a really good leader that actually has something compelling to say and a new direction, it's usually someone who was removed from the normal processes.
Yeah, I or even if you look outside of America, like someone like Winston Churchill, right? It's like
oh yeah.
His name eludes me a little bit. The guy who preceded him, but he had fucking
Chamberlain.
Cancer. Yeah, Chamberlain. He had fucking cancer. He's like, I'm dying, and everybody's like, oh, okay. And then the person who's supposed to succeed him was that guy Halifax, and then because Hitler was a threat, Winston Churchill was like, look, this guy's a pussy. And, like, I would be very good as a president in the war because I'm, like, I don't know, fucking crazy and, like, served in the Navy or whatever. And so you should elect me. And then people did, and he was incredibly popular until the end of World War II. And people were like, okay, maybe this guy's, like, a bad idea or whatever. But he's probably the most famous prime minister, I think arguably the most famous prime minister in, like, British history. And he was also someone who was, like, elected as an accident, as a result of like extenuating circumstances. So I completely agree with your point that like when democracy functions like as democracy should, especially in the United States where they have like a republic, like a senatorial republic, you get Joe Biden. Like Joe Biden is the leader who is created as a result of like democracy functioning as it should. He is, and I don't mean this in terms of like left, right, but he is the most conservative possible choice for a leader.
He's the most low risk choice would be a way to put it.
Right. And that's the thing. Like if you look at like companies, especially like tech companies or whatever, it's like what happens is they will have revolutionary ideas. Radio talks about this a lot, but they will have revolutionary ideas and they will release a product that's like very valuable and interesting and exciting to the consumer, and then they'll get all of this money, and then they'll get like a board of directors, and the board of directors will get rich, and then they immediately become very low risk because they don't want to fuck up what they have, and then the company slowly like withers and dies because they become incredibly risk averse, and it's hard to like change the world for the positive if you're not willing to like embrace risk at all. And democracy does seem to function in that way, where what we always end up with. You ever be with like 5 people in a car and you're trying to figure out where to go to eat?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, no, that's a lie, but for podcast purposes.
Okay, but if you're in a car with like 5 people and you're trying to figure out how to go to eat, there's like one person who's like, ooh, you know, would it be really good like if we went to fucking, I don't know, like a steakhouse, like we get like a nice steak or something, and someone else is like, well, I'm a vegan, they don't have anything for me there, and someone's like, well, let's go to fucking this like, you know, middle of the road restaurant that has all these options. Someone else is like, wow, everything there is really cheap and shitty. So everything debates back and forth, and then you all go get food that everybody thinks is like mostly fine. Everybody has like a 6.5 out of 10 meal experience because that is like what is in service of everyone who exists. And that's the selling point of like democracy functioning correctly is you get a leader. You get someone who is the leader of your country, who is like the highly unobjectionable. That's like what makes people happy, right? Like people didn't like Trump. He got elected, and there's a lot of talk about that. People didn't like Bernie Sanders. So it's like when this system functions correctly, you get someone who can rule over everyone, who is like minimally inspiring, minimally effective, like just like if you were to build a character in basketball and you were to even out all of the stats, that's like
yeah.
who you do. Yeah, and it's like that's the eventual result of this. The people just take it as granted, where it's like, this is what we should do, and it's like maybe that makes your fucking soul wither and die. Like, I don't know.
Okay, soul withering. Are we going to talk soul withering now?
Right. Okay.
Because this is what I think is important.
Okay, go ahead.
You brought up meaning, and I think the sense of meaning with fascism is really what makes it so powerful. Where, for some reason, fascism has an ability to really fucking dig in, and that's the juice behind it. If Marxism's problem is that it fucking collapses immediately, fascism's problem is it burns so hot that it turns the entire world into its enemy on purpose, then gets destroyed.
Nice. I mean, yeah.
And about the sense of meaning, I want to talk about Jonathan Haidt. Do you know him?
Yeah, the heterodox guy.
Probably. I don't know everything he does. He talks about social media addiction.
He wrote the coddling of the American mind. Yes.
What I love him for is he wrote Righteous Minds, Why Good and Bad People Are Divided Over Morality and Politics. Okay. And in there he gets on the basis of human morality. He breaks down the differences between how leftists and rightists use different sources of meaning. Or more specifically, people on the left draw from sources of morality that are universal to everyone, where people on the right draw from those as well, but they also draw from sources that only people on the right believe in. Things like in-group, out-group. It's actually one of my favorite books of all time. It changed my life.
Nice.
In it, he makes a claim that was interesting and really stuck with me for a variety of reasons. He basically makes the case that humans are 90% self-serving, Darwinian competition as individuals or, their families, like a chimpanzee would be, where chimpanzees will be in troops, but they only really cooperate with their relatives.
Okay.
And he says that's true 90% of the time. But he thinks that if you look at them, humans are 10% basically eusocial, like a beehive or an anthill, where humans do have this capacity in them that comes out in certain situations where they actually will identify with a very large group and sacrifice their own, evolutionary Darwinian interests for the group. For example, he talks about people in the military. They kind of will occasionally enter an altered state of consciousness where they feel like everyone on their side is an extension of themselves. There are lots of anecdotal stories about people doing things like jumping on grenades to save their fellows, which is really not something that jives with traditional Darwinian understanding of survival at all. And he talks about there are many things that do this, and makes the case that maybe, potentially, because group selection happened in the distant past sometime, humans do have this little nugget of eusocial instinct that pops out sometimes. And he also very specifically ties it to religion, where there's an aspect with religion where an entrenched religion will make non-relatives extremely cooperative with each other in a way that really no other social instinct, social things can. And with the fascism thing, I think an interesting thing about the thing that keeps me up at night about fascism is I feel like almost incidentally, fascists have discovered something really powerful and hidden within human beings. And they have found a way to use cultural machinery to bring it out. And a very specific thing about the religion thing, I know I'm bowling you over, but I will stop.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
About the religion thing, Haidt examines the durability of different religions, and he notices the number one thing predicting the survival of a small religious group that starts its own community is the number of sacrifices demanded of the members within the group. And that got me thinking about Hitler and stuff like, if you get on a stage and you use cultural artifacts to bind everyone together extremely tightly, and then you start screaming about this shared sense of loss during the war and the shared victimization, and from a position of authority, you scream shit that basically locks everyone in as the enemy of basically every other society, I think fascists might have found a way to use cultural programming to actually like activate a secret layer of the human mind that we don't have access to very readily in normal life.
Okay, first of all, Green, that's a sick idea, right? I know it's partly from Jonathan Haidt, but
it's going to get weirder. But please keep reacting.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm fucking stoked to hear that, and I just want to say that makes sense as like a counterpoint to the whole like DSA thing about like don't clap because people have audio sensitivities. It's like
you can't see, but I'm waving my hands.
these people are trying to activate like a social element, but there's almost like a lack of meaning, so it like doesn't function biologically. They're not on like the as I would call it like the vibe level. That's what it is, right? It's like I mean, I've said this a million times because it's my favorite quote in the world, and I won't navel gaze about it too much, but there's that idea where it's like Andrew Breitbart said politics are downstream from culture, and Akira the Don, famous DJ Akira the Don, said politics are downstream from culture, but culture is downstream from vibes. And that's
hell
the thing.
yeah.
It's like, like if you ever look at any of that, like Anna Ketchian talks about this, and she's right, where she's like, look, everything interesting artistically is coming out of like people online who have like far right political beliefs. That is all the innovative art that exists in the world right now. That's why mainstream movies suck or whatever, because there is like a vibe to fascism that's like attracting people right now. And so there's like, I don't know what you say, whatever you want about fascism, but it's got some real vibes. It functions on like a pure meaning level, and I think maybe that's like related to this eusociality thing that you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think, and I'm going to start making it weirder.
Nice.
A thing is, humans crave so much this feeling of boundary disillusion with each other. Not just with each other, with the world in general, but having the feeling of yourself as an individual melt away is one of the most powerful, ecstatic experiences that a human can have. This ties into my drug use. I know you're a psychedelic guy as well. That's a conversation for another day, maybe. But a thing is, the left approach to group politics is an increase of boundaries. It's, I'm a Marxist. I'm a leftist Marxist. I'm an intersectional queer feminist Marxist. I'm a non-binary, sometimes switching, Jewish Marxist with a purple hat. It's increasing boundaries over and over and over away, where it gives you cultural cachet within your group, but it's claustrophobic because you have all these borders and definitions separating yourself from these other people. There's not a lot of energy to it. But if you're on the right, if you draw one big boundary between your group and the other group, and you put more and more pressure on that one big boundary and make that the centerpiece of everyone's life, the smaller boundaries within that big boundary start to dissolve and become less important. Yeah. And you can actually reach a point of ecstatic, militaristic ecstasy of being united with your brothers, striving forth as a biological swarm that, it hates everything outside of it and loves everything within it, like a swarm of locusts. And the left, because they're so fucking bogged down with boundaries and definitions, it's really hard for them to do this. But the right just says, fuck yeah, turns on the rock music, and they can flip that switch, which I think is addictive, and that's where it comes from.
Yeah, I think, well, it's like that... It's like that thing Peterson says about how like people always point out that like, ooh, religion causes war, and that's like atheists are like, oh, look at all the war causes a consequence of religion, but that totally like overlooks the fact that like people naturally are in conflict with each other. And what religion does is create stability amongst incredibly large groups of people. So if you're subscribed to the same thing, you may fight with people who are subscribed to a different thing, but you don't fight with each other, right? Like the ability of like Christians to cooperate with each other is amazing. And that's that function of that hard boundary thing you're talking about, where it's like you unify around this like identity and these certain set of ideas, whether or not it's like, you know, Jesus died for our sins or whatever it is, and then all of the small things in the middle dissolve.
Yes, and I think I think that feeling is just so important. And religion is very interesting too, because religion simulates this feeling between non-relatives that feels like a family bond, and in a sense, it might actually be one. You know, life is complicated. It can do this. It also has mechanisms it's evolved over time for raising or lowering the pressure. I actually thought one great thing about Christianity, I'm kind of trapped in a point in my life where it's like, okay, maybe the supernatural is real. Maybe it's a Peterson metaphor thing. I'm still figuring that out. But a thing about Christianity that's so great is it has the devil, where Christianity has the power to hype people up with this group momentum thing. But it also has a completely harmless target where they can direct their rage and anger when they get a little too jazzed up. So it's almost like they have a release valve where it's like, rage against the devil if you are angry for a while. Let off the steam that way. Where in more rational systems, the only real target is the enemy. So if you get people hyped up, you now are at war with every country on the planet other than Japan, and you have to fucking make peace with that. Well, or maybe not.
No, that's a great point. I fucking hate the devil, dude. Fuck that. That devil's a fucking piece of shit.
Wait, but William James said, the world is all the richer for having the devil in it, so long as we keep our foot upon his neck, which is actually Hitler's role in our society, now that I say it.
Yeah, I know, but he's not as good, man. I'm going to say this right now, you know, Hitler worse than the devil. And I mean... he doesn't... Yeah. He doesn't work.
Oh, God. About the meaning thing... it was actually Douglas Murray who made the comment that he uses the phrase the second career of Adolf Hitler, where he talks about how the mandatory progressive policies of Europe and constant invocation of Nazi imagery as a justification for why you can't do that. In a very real way, we live in a world ran by Hitler. We just do the opposite of what he tells us.
That's a good point.
And an interesting thing is, I've been reading a book about the Nazi doctors. I'm not through it. I wish I could have gotten it done before we talked. I'm partway through it. The interviewer in that talks about how even decades after the war, long after the Holocaust has ended, he talked to several dozen Nazi doctors who were instrumental in setting up the Holocaust, unfolding the Nazi project. He said it was a very common sentiment where even men who are racked with guilt, men who have, well, that wasn't too many, honestly, but even men who admit that what they did was wrong, that Nazism never should have taken root, that it was a mistake, almost every single one of them, when they're talking about it, they would list into stories where the feeling of meaning and the vitality of being alive and the sense of purpose that Nazism gave them, they would get this starry, far-off look in their eye, like, God damn it, my life actually mattered. And it's so interesting where Hitler was explicitly trying to create this sense of meaning through conflict and set himself as this overlord figure that would cast meaning down on everyone around him and create this sense of purpose for the world. He did that just for everyone but Germany.
Huh. Okay.
In a way,
Hitler
won. And if you go to Germany now, I've never been there, but if you look at Germany now, the pride and shame situation, Hitler really kind of did what he wanted in a weird way, where every German has this incredibly powerful sense of ethnic solidarity just in the form of hating themselves and hating their history. Where Hitler had this incredible legacy of meaning, and America draws so much of its own meaning from World War II. Russia draws so much of its meaning from World War II. You could talk to Thupa about that. Hitler was this font of meaning and purpose for basically the entire human race. And he said he was doing that. It's just the plan he said was bad and everything happened. But if Hitler had not existed, all that secondary meaning we take from him now wouldn't have happened either. I'm not saying Hitler should have existed.
Well, but yeah, but that's the thing where like you have to give that clarifying statement. And it's like, look, this happened, right? Like we're going to live in a fantasy land. Like it's like, yeah, your point is absolutely correct. We are living in like the existential fallout of like what happened in the 20th century when like, ideology like intersected with technology in like this really, really terrifying way. And it's like we exist in the wake of that. And it's like that point you made. I really like that, where in chess the black pieces are anti-white pieces, but they're both fundamentally pro-chess.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's like if you hate Hitler, if you wake up every day and you actively hate Hitler, you are existing within like a Hitlerian framework. Like, the point you make about him wanting to give people meaning really makes sense, because like, you even look at something like the fact that he was like a painter, or like he didn't get into art school or whatever. That didn't happen because Hitler was like a shitty painter. It's because there were all of these trends in art at the time in Vienna that were like very deconstructive, right? That's like early Dadaism and or maybe not early Dadaism, but like Dadaism and like proto surrealism, where everything's very like deconstructive and obtuse, and that happens in visual art and that happens in music and stuff. And Hitler was like, no, you know what's sick? Fucking Wagner and like long ass like operas about like the glory of the German people. And he really did want to like imbue people with meaning. And so if you make a point that like people are defining themselves by reacting against him, that's still incredibly meaningful, right? Like even if you sort of are hating sort of like the ideas like expressed in some like Wagnerian opera, that's still existing within that framework. And so it's like, yeah, I get it. We have to say that like we think Hitler was bad, but the idea, sort of his diagnosis of like, the meaning crisis, that's like absolutely correct. He was on that way before anyone else. He saw like whatever, like The Scream, and was like, oh, this is terrible. We can't have people looking at this. This will just like, ruin everybody's minds. Yeah.
It'll become a mirror.
Kind of though, right? And it's like, yeah, he's not, that's absolutely correct. And so, what was my point? I guess his early identification of like how deconstruction would like lead the world astray. That he was on some shit with that. Just everything he did that was prescriptive turned out not to yield positive results.
I've gotten to a point where I think this is kind of the situation. It's like life is fake, like reality doesn't exist, like almost everything you hear is a lie. But I think there is true stuff. It's just generally not to be found in cultural construction. I think our cultural constructions are very valuable in their own way, but it's provisional kind of, and you have to understand that. I think this is actually it. I think having half of your belief structure collapse is really fucked up and makes you crazy. I think completely collapsing your belief structure will fix it usually. Where this is getting back to the psychedelic thing, where it's like if you wake up one day like Mussolini did, or not him, but in the essay they talk about this, how everyone realizes culture is provisional, and Mussolini's response is, yes, we will grab the reins of culture and rebuild it into something glorious. I think that if you break down to where you realize that so much of what you look at is only provisionally true, or it doesn't hold up, or how do you really know? I think the actual solution is completely destroy all concepts, including the self. And by this, I mean do a heavy dose of psychedelic drugs and have a mystical experience. And then by obliterating everything, you wake up, I guess. You get in touch with the fundamental force of truth that underlies your belief systems. Then you rebuild it. You understand it's provisional, but you remember where it came from, and that makes you okay with it.
Okay, to say what I can about that, because that's like a heady idea, but I was doing mushrooms with a friend one time, and he started talking to me about how three-dimensional space doesn't exist. Like, he doesn't believe in 3D space. And I was like, well, what do you believe? That we're all just like brains in jars, like experiencing the Matrix? He's like, no, because there can't be brains in jars, because that would like exist. I think the entirety of reality is just like this code that exists in like a boundless like plane of like Hebrew letters, and that code communicates with each other, and we are like living within that communication, and that is what we like experience as our reality in our 3D space. And this is what he was talking about when he was high on mushrooms, which is like a pretty heady, fairly abstract idea. But there is a point to be made where it's like, very often people will do this deconstructionist thing where they were like sort of, point out that something is flawed or use language to take apart some system. People are very good at like sort of filibustering reality so that you can't like effectively make any sort of an argument for how you feel. And it's this whole language game where they pretend that like nature doesn't exist. And so your appeal to sort of like collapsing your belief system and coming from what you're able to realize exists, it's like, that sounds radical, but that might be the only way. If you can get to a place where you're like, we are the communication of like, the Hebrew letters that like exist in something that can be like abstractly imagined as like a heaven or like the domain of God. If you can get there, I'd take drugs and take a step back and find something. I always call it nature, but find something that like acts as like an internal first principle, and then you're able to judge everything based against something that functions as like a known truth for yourself. And maybe it's not practical for everyone on earth to do that, but like you, person listening to this, you should definitely do that. You should definitely right now go take an unreasonably high dose of psychedelic drugs. Okay, maybe not, but it's not the worst.
I will say you should probably screen yourself for if you have a family history of schizophrenia and a few other mental health things, but at least be open to it. Be open to it. I have a horror of telling people to do psychedelics. I want everyone to be open to it, though. That is the thing about fascism and the psychedelic thing, where I've basically come to believe there's probably a solid 10 or 15% of crazy politic-brained people where if we just had shamans that we could send them to, they would be fine.
Yeah.
I don't think everyone's going to be open to psychedelics, but a significant minority of the people who are the problem, they could be fixed with drugs.
Yeah, like, do you know, like, that guy Vaush?
Only through memes and shit.
Yeah, like Vaush just on live stream talking about whatever he's talking about all of the time, like power dynamics and like how the left needs to unite, and just not to be, well, fuck it, like being a fat piece of shit and not like wearing a shirt and thinking about how he's like helping a world from like his dirty room to thousands of viewers. You give that guy having enough dose of psychedelics, he'll the first thing he'll think, I don't claim to speak for the machine elves or whatever's on the other side, but the first thing he'll think is probably something like, I should cut my fucking hair. I should cut my hair and I should trim my beard and I should put a shirt on and maybe go for like a walk around the block. And so I certainly think that guy would, be sorted out relatively quickly. And fuck it, I don't know, all those bread tuber people where having like fake conversations about nothing, they could do with some like getting in touch with some first principles.
The whole thing with that is, I've really come to believe humans are radically uncertain. Our beliefs are the best we can do. They matter, but we really don't understand the world at all. When someone is speaking from a position of like incredible certainty or like trying to own you with all these arguments and shit like Vosh does, I 100% believe that is not an attempt to engage with the world. That is about shoring up the mentality of your side and getting everyone on one thing. Where it's like Christian apologetics. They have intelligent men come up with satisfying answers to all the internal contradictions, and then everyone agrees to believe the same thing, not because that actually helped them in the world all that much, but because that contradiction could have caused the idea to pop out of their heads like an organ rejection, or like a rejected organ transplant. And it's entirely about the internal consistency of the group. I don't think people like Vosh are engaging with reality at all. I think they are 100% high priests that make people feel better about themselves.
Well, there's that Nietzschean quote where he says, and then we would be in a situation where you could roughly determine the value of a man by judging the amount of reality that he can stand.
That's slick.
Yeah, it's like reality is fucking tough, right? Like engaging with I'm not constantly engaged with reality. I'm in all sorts of delusions all the time, and it's like I get that the more I'm engaged with reality, sort of, the better I am as a person, or like the more optimized or tapped into my potential I am as a person. But it's just like, it's unreasonable to like expect people to engage with reality all the time. But if you're trying to change the world, you should probably be somewhat like in touch with what the world is. And it's like, not that I've done psychedelics that many times, but like when you're on psychedelics, you can think like sublingually. Like you have these clarifying realizations that are obviously true, that do not come from like constructive word games. It's not like that. It's about being able to think like outside of language. And I think that like that's really what it is, right? It's like the journey out of the cave or whatever. Like you retrieve knowledge and then you bring it back to people and you express it in words, but sort of playing all sort of these like bird language tweeting, chirpy games. You're not going to acquire anything valuable from doing that. And so, look, I'm not that smart or whatever. So certainly like getting very high is a way to do that. It's the way I've achieved like the 3 or 4 true insights that I feel like I've ever had.
I feel a lot of sympathy and relating to that. I completely believe that culture I think there's 2 kind of modes to culture. Okay, I'm going to just tell you something, Zombie. I'm going to tell you something I have never told anyone, but kind of defines my fucking existence.
Okay.
I had like a major, ideological, like religious revelation a few years ago that kind of put me on the whole path I am on now. I believe that humans like live in a chaotic world they don't really process at all. And our ideas, the thing about them is not whether or not they're rationally true. It's that ideas are built that depend on other ideas, and they actually move in a branching pattern away from us. Where if you use an idea to come up with another idea, that idea is dependent on the idea you used to get there. An example of this would be science. Like science as a final product sounds very pretty, and this doesn't need to be an anti-science thing because that could be hours. But in terms of how you actually interact with that information, science is actually really dependent on assumptions about human social life and the ability of humans to share information with each other.
Yes.
And so that is dependent on that, and that ideas actually branch away from us in this splitting pattern. I believe that human idea networks and belief systems are actually organic extensions of us, and that they are analogous evolution or convergent evolution with the way that mushroom mycelial networks will colonize food and spread out. My model for reality is that humans are in a context, our ideas grow out into the context, and that basically our human belief systems are mushrooms.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm insane. I've never told anyone that, but I've thought about it every hour for the last 3 years. So yeah, there you go, Zombie.
Wow. So that's trippy and groovy, but that's also like, it seems like a very effective way to think about things. So does that mean then that if people if they're connected by their ideas, that like our ideas and our ability to believe in the same thing, like make us one organism?
We'll get to that in a second. We'll get to that.
Okay.
I'll tell you that in a second, but I'll finish the thought. I think the cultural dimension is like a tendril of thought that projects out of like the more operative sections. I think it's almost like it's the tip of the growing structures of the human mind, like pushing out. And I think if you're using culture in an area that has already been colonized and developed, you're basically consolidating and filling every possible space within a narrow, confined space of resources that already exists. Where I see people like Vosh as there's like a little pocket of food that has already been brought in and colonized, and he's sending all these little wiry growing mycelium like through to like completely 100% consolidate and like mark out that space. But if you're on the periphery and you're casting culture into the unknown, that's using culture in an entirely different way. Yeah, and I think culture turned inward is inherently about social dominance. Culture cast outward is about learning and novelty and expanding human potential. And I think that's the difference with Vosh, where I don't want to be involved with Vosh at all because I see that as he's a fundamentally different type of mind than me, and he'll just corrupt what I'm doing, being cool guy out in the unknown.
Yeah, man. I'll co-sign all of that. Yeah.
And the reason I didn't answer to the mushroom thing, my first psilocybin experience, I actually had an insane life, like reality-shattering mystical experience where I merged with my wall and had a vision, and then I spent 10 minutes with a voice telling me in my bathroom that all life shares one consciousness, and that human competition is like just a necessary conceit of developing bodies that are capable of existing. That was the craziest thing that ever happened to me. The second craziest thing that ever happened to me was, which we'll say that for another day. Okay. The second craziest thing that happened to me was my first high dose, really medium dose. It was 3 grams. My first 3 gram psilocybin experience cured my depression, where I had a lot of mental issues going into it. And when I had my 3 gram psilocybin experience, the first part of it was, we don't need to get that into it, but like, I don't know, the love of God, like penetrated me and like, I don't know, fixed me, I guess. Beautiful. The mushrooms told me to forgive my like abusive, creepy stepfather. And after I said it out loud, for some reason I had to say it, but then like a penetrating like love thing came in and like told me a story with words about me getting over it, and it like healed my depression. Then a song about the mushroom dance, which I don't know what that is, lured me into another location, which is relevant to this conversation.
Okay.
My mental model of what happened was the first part of this trip was the mushrooms taking all the information of who I was, my self-image that existed from my childhood, and wiping it away and saying that information is gone now. And the second part of the trip was it recalibrating my brain's reward systems to the new image of who I was, where I now see myself as a much more capable person because that shit's gone. So we're going to boost your confidence and desire to engage with the world. And the second part of the trip, I floated into this very orange, very loud place where there was this booming, repeating rock sound, and the word delight was being chanted in this really booming way at the same time. And when I went into this space, I remember thinking, this is somewhere between a political rally and an ironworks. And I very specifically remember political rally being something in my head, or rather political rallies probably try to mimic this feeling. And I was in this space where people were chanting delight and there was this booming sound. And I was encompassed by this feeling of, I think it was the pure feeling of human positive motivation, where it was this crazy, heroic, we want to go out, we want to build, we want to fight, we want to strive, we want to chase new horizons, where it was this crazy pumping up, like, fuck yeah feeling of like, I could do anything. And very specifically, I remember thinking, this is probably how a cell in a body feels about the cells on either side of it, where everyone in this space, including me, this crazy, energetic political rally space, had this feeling of unity that was so complete, it wasn't the idea we're on the same side. It was the possibility of conceiving us of not being on the same side has been eliminated. And it awakened this like roaring feeling of heroic togetherness that I had never felt anything like that. And even based on the first half of the trip, which I could have predicted a little bit that would have happened. Okay, this feeling of love and self-acceptance, whatever. The second part, like heroic conquest, conquering like rage and desire to master matter and proliferate life upon the galaxy. And the thing about the fascism thing and learning about hate, it really makes me think, I think that's a core emotion. I think that's one of the fundamental human emotions, whatever the fuck delight is. And I think if you can get humans in this feeling of cooperating in a struggle together in the right circumstances, like maybe you can tap into it. And that's part of what fucking sends people onto crazy blood rages. I know that's the most... I've dumped more insanity on you than I have any right to, Zombie. I'm sorry. If you want to just talk for a while, I'm listening.
Well, all I would say is I don't think that that's that insane. You know what I mean? It's like... Because that is the sublingual thing, right? Like there are...
Yeah, yes.
You had an experience like that, you know, real, not real, whatever you want to call it. That happened. That is like something you went through that sort of revealed the truth to you. And it's like, you know, things exist for a long time for a reason, right? There's like yin and yang or whatever. And it's, I think that might be like a way of understanding what's going on right now. It's Eckhart Tolle, the sort of like new age spiritual leader, talked about this, where he's like,
yes.
Yeah, the sort of aggressive energy of what happened, you know, like in Nazi Germany in like the 1930s into the 1940s was such like just this reaction of like specific sort of targeted, triumphant, discriminating energy that now we're just in this wake of reactive energy where it's all about sort of like acceptance and like not being willing to be judgmental or like definitively judgmental in a specific way because of how dark it got when people really bought into the idea of being judgmental and like discriminatory. And so he's saying we're sort of like reflexively insane as like a result of that. And so that you proposing that it's like those are sort of like the two natural halves of like the human consciousness is like there's like a forgiveness and like a loving and like sort of, I don't know, accepting aspect, and then there is like a triumphant judgmental aspect, and sort of those are like inextricably tied. It's like, I mean, that makes sense. I could see that.
Yeah, I put you in the worst position anyone has ever put anyone in ever, right there. So
I don't know. I tried to, you know what? I give myself a bit of a grade on that. C+ or D+ to.
Oh no, you're fantastic. But I feel like and that really has made me feel humans need this sense of, you know, propagating themselves, of pushing their will and their selves out into the world. I feel like that's something very deep, and we have this situation now where everyone is so latched down and there's so little to do on Earth that actually matters, that isn't just a shell game for resources being funneled from you towards some rich person. And I think it's basically this, like maybe fascism will keep coming until we go to space. If we all go to space, we have a place to go. And I think that's what's going on here. I said this the other podcast too. We need to go to space so people don't kill each other.
I mean, I mostly agree. I think that's a bit of a distraction, though. This is not to go off on a whole other tangent because it seems like we're wrapping up, but it's like we don't want to export this shit to space. Our fucking insanity. We're gonna colonize Mars so we can accuse people of being fascists on Mars. It's that
you can be fascist on Mars because there's nobody there.
Have you seen Total Recall?
No.
Okay, so in Total Recall, there's like a Martian colony, and on the Martian colony, there's this like corrupt politician who has all of these corporate backers, and in the planet, there's this ancient like alien infinite energy machine that will like give Mars everything it needs to just like fully have unlimited energy and like terraform itself. And this guy, who's like the governor of the Martian colony, because he has these corporate backers, is trying to keep that machine secret so he can continue to charge everyone on Mars for air. Because on Mars, you like have to pay to breathe. And the guy who is like the main character in Total Recall is this dude who sort of, because there's other things in the story, is like schizophrenic and like had something done to his brain where he can't tell the difference between like fantasy and reality. So he doesn't know if he's delusional, is trying to find a way to like destroy this governor and make everyone aware of like the infinite energy machine. And it's like, we can't go to Mars and just do like neoliberal corporate dystopia. Everybody has to pay to breathe air on Mars. We need to look inside of ourselves and find like the infinite energy machine, and then it will like make sense for us to explore the cosmos. Is my
I mean, I did that, and the mushrooms told me to go to space. Not exactly. Terrence McKenna has a quote. He says that he is far too cynical for crusades, but the mushroom isn't. The mushroom is a gung-ho type of guy that has visions of man and fungus hand in hand to the stars. And the experiences I've got with mushrooms, it's like, I think that might be part of it. I think if we have a vision and a dream of some place that we can take humanity where there actually is a future, and not even a future, something to do that isn't just a fucking waste of time, I feel like people will come around. I do think looking inwards and then looking outwards is generally how it will go. Because looking inwards for me, it has never resulted in this, to an extent it has, this equanimity of mind, like, oh, everything's perfect, I'll just sit here. It's like, that kind of happens sometimes, but it's also like, we're going to space, we need delight, we need to get out there and do stuff.
We definitely do need delight. That's a good thing. We need delight, and we sort of need, it's like, we need faith in ourselves. I get that a bunch of things are fucked and it's annoying, but it's just like, let's presuppose that we will fix it, because that's the only thing that will sort of like move us forward. The idea that we eventually will be successful is the thing that's like so motivating. And so it's like, I don't want to, sit around and complain about how there's like all sorts of like wealth inequality. We just need to, I don't know, we need to identify we just need to, I know it's dumb, but we just need to go. Like, what's inside you? What does your will tell you to do? You know what I mean? Maybe like my thing, I'm going to spend my whole life convincing people that like poly is not an identity. It's not a real thing. You're not poly, and no one should be allowed to say that. And I just believe that eventually I will make that true, and that'll get me out of bed every single morning.
That is good. I think all identities are stupid.
Okay.
You don't know who you are, you fucking idiot. Anytime someone comes up to me and tells me, oh, I know who I am, it's like, no, you don't. I don't know if atoms are real. You think I know my identity?
Yeah, atom skeptic. And,
I know things have gotten a bit off the rails here towards the end. Zombie, is there any interesting place you would like to take things? I'm just going to give control to you for a moment here as penance for being weird.
No, that's okay. That was fascinating, dude. I know you were very vulnerable, but it's like, I mean, we had to get somewhere, right? Like, we started talking about, how the way people think about like political ideologies in the frame is insufficient, and then we were able to sort of like get outside of the frame, and that like really excited us. So, get yourself outside of your frame. That's very valuable. If you've enjoyed anything I said, zombie.substack.com/subscribe. That's zombie with 2 E's, no I. You can follow my newsletter, and fucking do that if you want, because look, you've listened this far. Clearly we're a little bit interesting, and I'll take drugs and I'll tell you about it.